I never imagined a friendly neighborhood barbecue could spiral into a trash war with my ex-military neighbor and end with something horrifying crawling out of my shed. The garbage war with my neighbor has taken a disturbing turn, but it wasn't my fault. Last weekend we had a gorgeous spring day, so I called up a few buddies for an impromptu celebration. I fired up the grill for the first time this year, stocked the cooler with beer, and we had a blast. Sure, we got a little loud, but nothing too crazy, just some old friends catching up while my wife Haley was out with her friends. Around sunset, I heard a voice yell, "Hey!" I turned and saw my neighbor Tucker's crew-cut head sticking up over the fence. Tucker was an ex-military guy who'd served a few tours in Afghanistan. His no-nonsense, stern demeanor made him the last person you'd want staring you down while looking pissed off. "You keep it down," Tucker shouted. "Sorry, Tucker." I waved good-naturedly. "We'll tone it down." I turned to my friends and said, "All right, guys, let's move this party inside." The night continued, harmlessly drinks, laughter, stories, and eventually we ran out of beer. Across the street is a convenience store, so I volunteered for a beer run. My friends stayed behind, laughing and chatting while I stumbled my way across the road. When I got back, the drinks flowed again, and when my wife finally came home, we were plastered. Everyone caught cabs home. That blissful night was short-lived. At 6 a.m., I was jolted awake by someone banging violently on the front door. At 36, I don't recover like I used to. My head throbbed like a dagger jammed into my skull. My ears buzzed. My mouth tasted like chemicals. But the banging persisted. Barely functioning, I made it to the door. Peeking through the window, I saw Tucker on the porch, veins bulging in his neck, eyes burning with fury. "Crenshaw, open the door." Without thinking, I did. Tucker was standing there, holding what looked like a condom filled with urine, tied like a grotesque balloon. "You think this is funny?" he growled. My brain struggled to process. "What is that? What's going on?" "Don't play dumb," Tucker snapped. "I know this came from your porch. I know you threw it into my yard." I was genuinely offended. It wasn't me. It's probably from those idiots across the street. There's always litter blowing over from the convenience store. Through my hangover haze, I guessed that's where Tucker's surprise had come from, but Tucker wasn't buying it. "You know what I did in Afghanistan, Crenshaw?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I specialized in projectile warfare. I know the physics. This trash came from your porch." "No, sir," I said, my temper starting to boil. "You've got no right to accuse me of something so juvenile." Tucker growled, spun on his heels like he was still on duty, and stormed off. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. Hours later, I got a text from my buddy Steve. "How did Tucker like the old condom bomb? Launched it while you were at the store, LOL." I froze. "Steve." I ran outside to apologize, only to see Tucker in his driveway, backing his car straight into my trash bin. 3 garbage bags exploded across my muddy yard: chicken carcasses, broken glass, used maxi pads. Fair enough, I thought bitterly. I guess that's fair enough. But rage simmered inside me. I hadn't thrown that condom. It wasn't my fault. Yet here I was, cleaning up his trash. Then Steve texted again. "Sorry about the trouble with your neighbor. I owe you a few rounds, man." By midnight, Steve and I were wasted, and drunk logic is dangerous. You know what we should do, Steve said. We're going to take the bag of cat poop and pissy litter from your cats, and we're going to launch it at his front door. Give O.L. Sergeant Payne a taste of his own medicine. And that's exactly what we did. The next morning, I was too ashamed to face Tucker, but when I tried to apologize later, he just smiled an eerie, too wide smile and said, "We did let things get out of hand, didn't we? A snafu. But don't worry, let's just put it behind us." I believed him. I let my guard down. A week later, Haley and I decided to prep our garden. That's when I smelled it. Rotten, thick, suffocating. I followed the stench to the shed. My stomach turned as I approached, the buzzing of flies growing louder. When I opened the door, I gagged. The shed was filled wall to wall with rancid garbage. Rotting apples, used diapers, coffee grinds, chili-stained bones. And then I saw it. A shadow moved. Something inside the garbage. Before I could process it, the heap shuddered, rising into a hulking, nightmarish figure made entirely of trash. Its head twitched uncontrollably. It had bottle caps for eyes, spaghetti for hair, and a grotesque, mustard-stained garbage appendage I won't even describe. It screeched an unholy sound that shook my bones, and then it moved toward me. I don't know how to explain it. A trash monster? A neighbor feud turned supernatural? All I know is Tucker started it, and I'm afraid it's not over yet. I turned to run, my heart pounding, but my legs felt like they were made of cement. The trash monster lunged forward, its grotesque, congealed body lurching and screeching. Its arms stretched unnaturally, one finger ending in an empty toilet paper roll, the other looking like a jagged toothpick. The smell, it was unbearable. Rotten meat, sour milk, and something worse, a mix of death and decay. I stumbled back into the house, slammed the door shut, and locked it, my hands shaking. My wife, Haley, came rushing in from the kitchen, her eyes wide with confusion and panic. "Rob, what's going on?" It's Tucker. It's the trash, it's alive." I stammered, trying to catch my breath. Haley stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "What are you talking about?" Suddenly, a thunderous bang shook the house. We both jumped. It was coming from the shed, no, closer now, the backyard. I peeked out the window and froze. The trash monster stood there, its deformed body shifting and bubbling like it was barely holding itself together. It raised an arm, long and dripping, and hurled a bag of garbage straight at the window. Glass shattered, and shards flew into the living room. "We need to get out of here," I shouted, grabbing Haley's arm. We bolted to the front door, but as I twisted the knob, something heavy thudded against the porch outside. I looked through the peephole and my blood ran cold. It was Tucker. Only it wasn't Tucker, not anymore. His skin was pale, tinged gray, his eyes sunken and lifeless. He stood motionless, holding a garbage bag in his hand, a twisted grin plastered across his face. "You started this, Rob," he whispered, though I couldn't see his lips move. I pulled Haley back, my mind racing. We were trapped. The front was blocked, the backyard was crawling with that thing, and Tucker, whatever he'd become, was guarding the door. "The garage," I whispered. "Let's go through the garage." We sprinted through the kitchen and into the garage. My hands fumbled to hit the button for the garage door, and the motor groaned to life. But then I heard it. A wet, sloshing sound from the dark corner of the garage. I turned slowly, my breath caught in my throat. The trash monster was there, inside, shifting out of a pile of garbage I'd forgotten to take out earlier in the week. It rose up, screeching louder than before, its bottle cap eyes fixed on me. I grabbed a shovel instinct kicking in and swung it as hard as I could. The shovel hit its chest with a disgusting splat, but it didn't slow the creature down. It just kept advancing, its spaghetti hair swaying, its body oozing. "Run," I screamed at Haley. We ducked under the half-open garage door and ran into the street. Behind us, I could hear the trash monster thudding its way out of the garage, leaving slimy streaks of muck as it moved. Tucker was still there, standing in the driveway, watching us with his twisted smile. "It doesn't stop, Rob," he said softly, his voice echoing in my head. "You can't fight it." I didn't stick around to argue. Haley and I ran down the street, past darkened houses and empty driveways, our only company the sound of our footsteps and the distant squelch of the trash monster chasing us. We finally made it to a nearby gas station. The clerk gave us a weird look as we stumbled inside, covered in sweat and shaking. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. "What's your emergency?" There's a monster," I panted. "In my house. In my yard." I stopped. How was I supposed to explain this? That my neighbor stuffed my shed full of garbage and somehow a monster came out of it. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone. "Sir, we'll send an officer to check it out." When we returned with the police an hour later, the house was eerily quiet. The shattered window was still there, the broken glass crunching under our feet. But the trash monster was gone. The shed door hung open, and the stench had faded to nothing. Tucker's driveway was empty. It was like none of it had ever happened. One of the officers turned to me, his expression skeptical. "You said there was someone here? A creature?" I nodded, my face pale. "Yes, Tucker. And something in the trash. I swear it was real." The officer shook his head. "The house is clear. There's no one here. But we'll keep an eye on things." Haley and I moved out of that house the next day. I never saw Tucker again. His house stayed dark, empty. But every now and then on quiet nights, when the wind is still, I swear I hear it. A low, wet squelch, and a distant screech. I haven't taken the trash out after dark since. Maybe Tucker was right. Maybe it doesn't stop. All I know is this: if your neighbor ever accuses you of throwing trash into their yard, apologize immediately. Because trust me, you don't want to see what happens next. The perfect neighborhood, the perfect garden. But nothing grows without sacrifice. I learned that too late after I dug too deep and discovered what was buried beneath the flowers. When I first saw Greenfield Estates, I thought it was perfect, a quiet suburban neighborhood with rows of charming homes, bright gardens, and smiling neighbors. It seemed like the fresh start my kids and I needed after a messy divorce. The brochure practically sold itself. The perfect place to grow. After the chaos of the past year, stability was exactly what I wanted for my 10-year-old daughter, Emma, and my 6-year-old son, Toby. From the moment we arrived, The neighbors couldn't have been more welcoming. Martha, a spry woman in her 60s with a dazzling smile, brought over cookies. Her husband Harold gave me tips on keeping the grass green. But what stood out most was how obsessed they all seemed with their gardens. The yards on our street were pristine, bursting with roses, hydrangeas, and perfectly symmetrical hedges. There wasn't a weed in sight. Martha even gave me a bag of fertilizer on our first day, insisting it was the secret to their success. "It's organic," she said, placing the bag in my hands. "Just a little sprinkle will do wonders. You'll have the most beautiful garden in no time." Her smile lingered a moment too long, her blue eyes unblinking. It made me uncomfortable, but I thanked her and set the bag in the garage, figuring I'd try it later. By the end of our first week, the kids had settled in, and I decided to try gardening. My yard felt like the only blemish on the street, overgrown with weeds and dry patches of dirt everywhere. I spent an afternoon pulling weeds, planting marigolds, and scattering a bit of Martha's fertilizer as a finishing touch. The next morning I was shocked to find the marigolds already sprouting. By the end of the week they were enormous, with thick, waxy petals and stems that seemed to sway even when there was no breeze. "Wow, Mom," Emma said, running outside to admire them. "They're beautiful." I was pleased, but something about the plants unsettled me. The marigolds looked too perfect, their colors almost unnaturally vibrant. That night I heard Toby crying in his room. When I went to check on him, he was sitting up in bed, staring at the window. "What's wrong, honey?" I asked. "They're whispering," he said, pointing to the backyard. I glanced outside, but it was pitch black. "You probably heard the wind," I said, brushing his curls back. "No," Toby insisted, his voice trembling. "They said my name." Over the next few weeks, things got stranger. The plants grew at an alarming rate, vines climbing up the side of the house, flowers blooming in colors I'd never seen before. The neighbors noticed too. "Your garden looks incredible." Martha beamed, clapping her hands together. "Thanks," I replied, though I felt uneasy. "That fertilizer of yours really works." She leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "Remember to use it sparingly. Too much, and, well, it can get out of hand." That night I woke to the sound of the back door creaking open. My heart raced as I grabbed a flashlight and crept downstairs. The door was ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. I stepped outside and found Toby standing barefoot in the garden, his tiny hand reaching toward the vines. "Toby," I hissed, rushing to him. His eyes were open but glazed over, as though he were in a trance. "They're calling me," he murmured. I scooped him up and carried him back inside, locking the door behind me. When I checked his feet, they were covered in tiny scratches, as if the plants had clawed at him. The next morning I installed new locks and told the kids to stay out of the garden, but deep down I knew it wouldn't be enough. One sleepless night, I looked out the window and saw movement in Martha's yard. She was kneeling in her garden, digging furiously with her hands. The moonlight illuminated her face, twisted in concentration. Then she dragged something into the hole, something limp and wrapped in a tarp. My stomach turned as I realized it was the size of a person. The next day I confronted her. "Martha, what were you doing outside last night?" Her smile faltered for the first time. "Just gardening," she said briskly, her tone sharp. "You shouldn't spy on your neighbors." Her reaction only fueled my paranoia. I began researching Greenfield Estates, searching for anything that might explain the odd behavior. What I found was chilling. Reports of missing persons over the years, all centered around this neighborhood. Families who had vanished without a trace, leaving behind homes with flourishing gardens. That night, armed with a flashlight and a kitchen knife, I went outside, determined to uncover the truth. I dug into the soil near the marigolds. After only a few inches, my shovel hit something soft. It wasn't a root, it was flesh. I recoiled in horror, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The marigolds seemed to lean toward me, their petals quivering. I could swear I heard whispers, soft, silent voices calling my name. When I tried to stand, the vines coiled around my ankles, tightening like snakes. I hacked at them with the knife, the sound of snapping stems eerily like breaking bones. I ran inside, bolted the door, and shook as the whispers grew louder, filling the house. The air smelled sickly sweet, like rotting fruit. The next morning, Emma came to me holding a flower from the garden. "Look, Mom, it's so pretty." I snatched it from her, my heart pounding. The stem was slick with something dark and sticky. Blood. I knew we had to leave. As I packed our bags, the hum of voices grew louder, rattling the windows. The neighbors were waiting. Martha stood at the foot of the driveway, pruning shears in hand. Harold held a shovel, and others carried rakes and pitchforks. "Where are you going?" Martha asked, her voice unnervingly calm. "We're leaving," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "I'm afraid we can't let you do that," she replied. "The garden still needs you." The neighbors advanced, tools glinting in the moonlight. I grabbed Toby and Emma and bolted back into the house. The plants were alive now, vines snaking through the walls, flowers blooming in grotesque bursts. The whispers were deafening. I grabbed a can of lighter fluid from the garage, doused the garden, and struck a match. The flames roared to life, consuming the plants and casting an orange glow on the neighbors' horrified faces. The vines writhed and screamed as they burned, the voices fading into silence. We fled that night, leaving everything behind. I never reported what happened. Who would believe me? Months later, I saw an ad for Greenfield Estates online. The photos showed vibrant gardens and smiling families. The description read, "The perfect place to grow." I closed my laptop, the hum of whispers lingering in my mind. If you move into a neighborhood where the gardens look too perfect, do yourself a favor, don't ask why, because you might not like what's buried underneath. The knocking came at midnight, and when I opened the door, I saw something that made my blood freeze myself. Same face, same scar, same clothes. What would you do if your own reflection stepped off the mirror and smiled back at you? When I first moved into Sycamore Circle, it felt like a sanctuary. After my wife Ann passed away, I needed a change of place to heal. Sycamore Circle was the perfect choice, a quiet cul-de-sac with just 10 homes, each with its own picket fence and perfectly manicured lawn. Everyone seemed kind, polite, and genuinely welcoming. It was the sort of neighborhood where people still waved to one another, where kids rode bikes until sunset, and porch lights flickered on in unison as the sky grew dark. At first, I didn't notice anything strange. Moving boxes kept me busy, and the neighbors came by one to introduce themselves. Mrs. Harlan from 2 houses down brought cookies, and the couple across the street, the Carsons, offered to help me unpack. They all seemed so normal. But it didn't take long for that veneer of normality to crack. It started small. I'd step outside to grab the mail and see Mrs. Harlan watering her plants, and then notice Mr. Carson doing the same, his hose spraying in the exact same rhythm as hers. At first, I chalked it up to coincidence, but then it happened again and again. Every morning at exactly 7:15 a.m., every single garage door on the street would open simultaneously. The neighbors would step out, coffee mugs in hand, and wave to each other in perfect unison before climbing into their cars and driving off. When I mentioned it to Mrs. Harlan, she laughed it off. "Oh, we're just creatures of habit around here." But it wasn't just habits. It was everything. They mowed their lawns at the same time, took out the trash on the same day, and walked their dogs in synchronized loops around the cul-de-sac. Even their smiles were the same wide, toothy, and hollow, like they were rehearsing for a play I hadn't been cast in. The first truly strange event happened 3 weeks in. It was 2 a.m., and I was startled awake by loud, deliberate knocking at the front door. My heart thudded in my chest as I stumbled to the entryway, my eyes still adjusting to the darkness. When I opened the door, I froze. Standing on my porch was me. It wasn't just someone who looked like me. It was me. Same disheveled hair. Same pajamas. Even the same scar on my chin from a childhood bike accident. The figure smiled mirthlessly, its eyes glinting in the dim light. "Paul," it said, in a voice that sounded exactly like mine. "Aren't you going to invite me in?" My mouth went dry. I slammed the door shut and locked it, stumbling backward into the living room. My mind raced to make sense of what I'd seen. I sat up the rest of the night, bat in hand, jumping at every creak and shadow. By morning it felt like a fever dream. But when I checked the front porch, I found footprints in the dew-covered grass, my footprints leading away from the house. From that point on, the neighbors started acting differently. When I walked outside, their heads would turn in unison to watch me. They didn't smile anymore. They just stared, hollow, unblinking. One afternoon, as I mowed the lawn, I caught movement in the Carsons' window. I turned off the mower and squinted into the shadowy kitchen. Mrs. Carson stood there, staring at me with that empty expression. Behind her, I saw the reflection of someone else, someone who looked exactly like me standing over her shoulder, grinning. I ran inside and locked the doors. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside, whispers and faint knocking that seemed to come from every wall. At midnight the knocking returned, louder this time. I didn't answer. I sat in the dark, gripping the bat, as the sound moved around the house, first the front door, then the windows, then the back door. Paul, the voice called softly, mimicking my own. "Let me in." I covered my ears and squeezed my eyes shut. When the noise finally stopped, I dared to look outside. The cul-de-sac was filled with neighbors. They stood silently on their lawns, staring at my house. In the center of the street, a figure stood apart from the rest. It was me. The figure tilted its head, and even from a distance, I could see it smiling. I knew I couldn't stay. I packed a bag, grabbed my car keys, and slipped out through the garage. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The neighbors were standing in the street, their heads turning slowly to follow my car. My double stood at the end of the cul-de-sac, watching me go. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I pulled into a gas station, hands trembling as I filled up the tank. When I went inside to pay, the cashier looked up and frowned. back so soon?" he asked. What I said, my voice shaking. "You were just here," he replied, eyeing me suspiciously. I left without another word. That was a year ago. I've moved 3 times since then, but it doesn't matter. No matter where I go, I see them, my neighbors from Sycamore Circle. They stand at the edge of the woods, or across the street, or in the crowd at the grocery store, always watching. And sometimes late at night, there's a knock at the door. Just one. I don't open it anymore. I already know who's there. Imagine moving to a new place, hoping for friendship and peace, only to find yourself entangled in a chilling mystery where trust is the deadliest game. What happens when the friendliest face hides the darkest secret? Stay tuned for a story that will keep you questioning everyone around you until the very last word. I didn't kill my neighbor's wife. This isn't some confession story, and if you think I did, you're wrong. But someone I know did. Jeff and Asha were a great couple, always friendly and approachable. Jeff and I often checked in with each other whenever we bumped into one another outside our condos. "What's up, buddy? What are you doing this weekend?" Jeff asked one Friday evening, smiling as he shut his car door. "Just nothing, I guess," I replied, shrugging. "That's not true. You're coming to our place," he said, grinning. I was overjoyed. Although I didn't have many close relationships, I like to think Jeff and I were good friends, regardless of how often we hung out. "Oh, sure," I replied, trying not to sound too eager. "All right, tomorrow night at 6 p.m. we'll introduce you to a couple of people," he said, waving as he made his way inside. "Great," I said softly, standing next to my car and staring at his now closed front door. "What a piece of garbage," a voice said from behind me. Startled, I turned around to see who had spoken. An odd man I'd never seen before stood there, smoking a cigarette. He was about my height, with an athletic build and short black hair. He stood by the street in front of a neighboring condo, his sweaty, stern expression making me uneasy. "Sorry, I just had to listen in as that condescending prick forced himself on you," he added, his tone sharp. "I don't know that he's any of those things," I said, defensively, pushing up my glasses. "Well, you should think again. That guy's as fake as they come," he said, flicking his cigarette into the street. "Well, I didn't hear him invite you tomorrow, so don't join us and there won't be any problems," I said firmly, walking inside and shutting the door before he could respond. The next day, I arrived at their house at 5:40 p.m. "Oh, Ryan, glad to see you." Asha greeted me warmly, turning her head over her shoulder as she looked for Jeff. She led me inside their beautifully decorated home. "Hey, bud, you're just a little early, but no biggie," Jeff said with his usual smile, standing by the grill outside. I shrugged and sat down at their kitchen table. "Thanks for having me," I said, scooting my chair closer to the table. "Yeah, well, we hope you have a good time," he said before stepping outside to start grilling. Asha stayed in the kitchen, preparing snacks. I waited patiently, noticing how she occasionally glanced at me when she thought I wasn't looking. Her attention to detail was evident from the neat arrangement of the food to the little umbrellas in the plastic cups for mixed drinks. Everything was meticulously organized, a testament to her perfectionism. Soon the doorbell rang, and their friends began to arrive. She didn't realize I could hear her whispering to each guest before leading them into the kitchen to meet me. "Ryan, this is Taylor and Alex," Jeff said, holding his beer and gesturing toward two men who entered the room. "Nice to meet you, Ryan," Taylor said, extending his hand for a handshake. "Thanks," I replied, taking a sip of my drink. Taylor pulled his hand back and smiled. "Hey, you guys, help me outside real quick," Jeff said to Alex and Taylor, opening the sliding glass door and leading them out. More people arrived, filling their small condo space. Despite the crowd, no one sat directly next to me until him, the stranger from the night before. "Why are you here?" I asked, my unease growing. "I was invited," he said calmly, sipping his beer and looking around the room. "Jesus, is she trying hard enough?" he muttered. "Look at this place. Does she spend every second cleaning and organizing? Get a life." "I think you're being too harsh on her," I said. "Really? You think this isn't all for show? You buy that they're perfect and better off than everyone else?" he asked, sneering. "They're nice people," I replied, annoyed. "Nice to you because you're useful. But deep down you know they're fake," he said, leaning closer. I looked over at Jeff and then at Asha, who caught me staring before scratching her head and moving deeper into the living room. "Who are you?" I asked, my patience wearing thin. "I'm Dale," he said, smiling. That smile sent a chill down my spine. I knew instantly he was trouble. Over the next few weeks, Dale wouldn't leave me alone. He latched on to me, always bad-mouthing Jeff and Asha. His hateful remarks about Asha were the worst. One day, unable to take it anymore, I shouted at him during another of his rants. "They're my friends." The room went silent as everyone turned to look at me. Embarrassed, I stormed out of the party and went home, feeling awful about losing my temper. The next morning I decided to apologize. Jeff was out, so I knocked on their door, knowing Asha was likely home. She seemed surprised and uneasy when she saw me. "What are you doing here, Ryan?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I wanted to apologize about last night," I said, avoiding her gaze. "You shouldn't just walk into our house like this," she said, her tone firm. "It wasn't my fault," I said quickly. "Dale isn't really your friend. He's been saying terrible things about you." She stared at me, her eyes welling with tears. "Ryan, I need you to leave," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Confused, I left without another word. Outside, I saw Dale waiting. "What did you say about me?" he demanded, his expression furious. "Nothing that wasn't true," I replied, trying to stay calm. He paced the porch, seething. "She's going to get what she deserves," he muttered before storming off. That evening, Jeff found Asha unresponsive. She didn't survive. My heart broke for Jeff, but he distanced himself from me after that. I'm certain Dale killed her, though I didn't see it happen. His hatred for her was evident from the moment I met him. I tried telling the police about him, but they insisted no one named Dale lived in our neighborhood. They must be mistaken. Or maybe Dale was something else entirely. What if your neighbor's kindness wasn't just neighborly but a calculated game of manipulation and control? In this spine-chilling tale, the house next door hides secrets that blur the lines between friendly gestures and sinister intentions. Hold on to your seat, won't believe where this story takes you. When we first moved into Sunnybrook Estates, I thought we'd found our dream home. It was a charming little house with a wraparound porch, a lush front yard, and a quiet neighborhood filled with smiling faces. My wife Leela and I, newlyweds, were eager to build our lives together, and this place seemed like the perfect backdrop. Our next-door neighbor, Mrs. Eldridge, was the first to welcome us. She appeared at our door on moving day, holding a plate of chocolate chip cookies warm and fragrant. Her gray hair was pinned neatly into a bun, and her blue eyes twinkled like sunlight reflecting off her perfectly polished garden stones. She seemed harmless, kind even in her floral apron and pearl necklace. I just wanted to say hello to my new neighbors. She said, her voice as soft as a lullaby. I'm Mrs. Eldridge. If you need anything at all, don't hesitate to ask. Her cookies were delicious. She invited us over for tea the next day, and Leela, always eager to make friends, happily accepted. I tagged along, curious about our new neighbor. Her home was impeccable, not a speck of dust in sight. The floral wallpaper looked as though it had been hung the day before, and the air smelled faintly of lavender and lemon. Her garden, visible through the kitchen window, was a riot of color roses, tulips and lilies blooming simultaneously, defying the seasons. You have a lovely home, I said. Mrs. Eldridge smiled, her eyes lingering on me for a moment too long. Thank you, Max. I try my best to keep it welcoming. It wasn't until later that I realized I hadn't introduced myself. Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Eldridge became a fixture in our lives. She brought over pies, offered gardening tips, and somehow always appeared at just the right moment, whether we were unloading groceries, arguing over a broken shelf, or sitting on the porch in silence. She's just lonely, Leela said when I voiced my unease. She's old, Max. She probably doesn't have anyone else. But things began to feel off. One night I woke up to a strange sound, muffled crying, faint but persistent. I nudged Leela awake, and we both listened. It seemed to be coming from Mrs. Eldridge's house. The next morning I asked her about it. Oh, I was watching an old movie, she said with a laugh. I didn't mean to disturb you. But there was something in her smile that didn't reach her eyes. The strange noises became more frequent whispers, crying, and once, a low growl that made my skin crawl. I tried to brush it off, but the unease grew. Mrs. Eldridge's uncanny knowledge of our lives didn't help. She mentioned my fear of drowning, a secret I hadn't even told Leela. She complimented a song Leela had been humming the night before in the shower when our windows were closed and the bathroom was far from hers. Maybe she's just intuitive. Leela suggested, though her tone was less certain. One rainy afternoon, while cleaning out the attic, we found the diary. It was old, the leather cover cracked and faded, the pages yellowed with age. The name on the first page was Sarah Nolan, our home's previous tenant. The entries started innocuously enough. Mrs. Eldridge is so sweet. She brought me muffins today. I feel so lucky to have such a kind neighbor. But as I read further, the tone shifted. She knows too much about me. I never told her about my dad, but she mentioned his death today so casually. It felt wrong. The final entry was chilling. She's watching me. I hear her at night, whispering through the walls. I think she's inside my head. I'm scared. If you're reading this, get out. Don't let her know you found this. Leela and I stared at each other, the air thick with dread. That night, the noises grew louder. The whispers seemed to seep through the walls, filling every corner of the house. Shadows flickered where there shouldn't have been any, and the temperature dropped sharply. Leela clutched my arm, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "We have to leave," she whispered. But when I opened the front door, Mrs. Eldridge was standing on our porch, smiling up at me. "Is everything all right?" I tried to answer, but my words stuck in my throat. Her eyes gleamed unnaturally in the dim light, and for the first time I noticed how still she was. Too still, not a twitch, not a blink. She stepped inside before I could stop her. "I think you've been reading things you shouldn't," she said, her voice soft but menacing. Over the following days, things spiraled. Leela and I fought constantly, our once happy home now suffocating with tension. I began to doubt my own thoughts, my memories. Mrs. Eldridge was everywhere, always watching, always smiling. Desperate, Leela found an old book on banishing malevolent spirits. It spoke of entities that fed on fear, twisting their victims' lives until they were consumed entirely. The ritual required fire, salt, and blood specifically, a sacrifice. The night we performed the ritual was the longest of my life. Leela drew the symbols while I gathered the materials. Mrs. Eldridge appeared as we began, her pleasant facade melting away to reveal a grotesque form. Her skin was mottled and stretched, her mouth filled with needle-like teeth. She laughed, a sound that chilled me to my core. "You think you can get rid of me?" she hissed. "I've been here longer than you can imagine." Leela chanted the incantation, her voice trembling. The house shook, and Mrs. Eldridge screamed, her body writhing as the symbols began to glow. In the end, the ritual worked, but not without cost. Leela collapsed, her face pale and lifeless. Mrs. Eldridge was gone, but so was my wife. Now I sit alone in this house, surrounded by silence. The garden is overgrown, the walls are cracked, and I can still feel Mrs. Eldridge's presence. Some nights I hear her laughter in the distance. I know she's not truly gone, and I know she's waiting for me.